So Andy Ruiz and Jarrell Miller battled to a controversial 12-round majority decision draw, and it was controversial. Now, going into this fight, there were two main questions for me. Will Andy Ruiz get backed up by the bigger man in Jarrell Miller, and how will he cope with it? That's actually two questions. But also, will Jarrell Miller's punch resistance be affected by the stoppage defeat to Daniel Dubois and the weight loss? I mentioned in my pre-fight video that while both Ruiz and Miller are pressure fighters, they primarily like to come forward and push their opponents back, they're two different types of pressure fighter. Miller is more of a traditional volume punching pressure fighter. He comes forward and tries to overwhelm you with his punch output, his physical strength. He mauls you on the inside, all that type of stuff. Whereas Andy Ruiz is actually a front foot counter puncher. He isn't a volume puncher. He doesn't tend to throw that many shots coming forward compared to a traditional pressure fighter, volume puncher, as I say. And so I was curious to find out how Andy Ruiz would cope if he gets pushed onto the back foot by Jarrell Miller and outworked. And that's where the question about Miller's punch resistance would come in, right? Coming off a stoppage defeat, losing 30 pounds in weight, you can't be certain that that won't have a detrimental effect. And in order for Andy Ruiz to win this fight convincingly, you'd have to figure that he'd need to get Jarrell Miller's respect. He'd have to be able to hurt him or at least buzz him in order to keep him off and prevent Miller from working him over. Because typically that's what Andy Ruiz does in his fights. You look at his first loss, which was against Joseph Parker. Because Ruiz is such a sharp counterpuncher coming forward, he discourages his opponents from throwing a lot of shots. And that allows Andy Ruiz to fight at a pace that he's comfortable with. But with Jarrell Miller, if he can't buzz him, if he can't intimidate him the way he normally does with his opponents, if he can't discourage Miller from leading, because Miller's not afraid of the counters, then it's going to be very, very interesting to see how Andy Ruiz copes. And so we got our answer in this fight. Ruiz did not cope particularly well. Now, in the first 4 rounds, Ruiz was rattling off some nice combinations. He was getting his jab off. Miller looked a little shaken a couple of times. Nothing major, but he did look a little buzzed by some of the shots that Ruiz caught him with. But I noticed very early on that Ruiz was trying to clinch Jarrell Miller. And Ruiz isn't a guy that generally clinches a lot, right? It's normally his opponents trying to clinch him. But in this case, Ruiz was trying to clinch Miller. And that was the first indication that he wasn't comfortable with the pace. He was being forced to work harder than he's accustomed to, than he likes to. Now, the commentators kept banging on about Ruiz's inactivity, and I've got no doubt that inactivity played some part in the way this fight turned out. But I think more than anything, it was Jarrell Miller's style. For the reasons I've just given you, he forced Andy Ruiz to fight at a pace that he's just not accustomed to, because Miller is physically enormous, 300 pounds. He's got a very good chin, throws a lot of shots, keeps pushing forward. He mauls you on the inside. He's got his forearm up under your chin and he's pulling you around and leaning on you. Nobody's ever done that to Andy Ruiz before. And you never know how a guy who's not accustomed to that kind of thing is going to cope with it. So as I say, Ruiz won the early rounds with the fast combinations, but he was being forced to work at a pace he was uncomfortable with. He started getting tired around, the 4th or 5th. And that's when Jarrell Miller, for me, started taking over, hitting Andy Ruiz with body shots. He was also very clever in finishing the end of many of the rounds with a fast combination, usually to Andy Ruiz's body. And those shots were really taking it out of Ruiz. Now, Miller is not a massive puncher, and it's a good thing because Andy Ruiz would have got stopped if he was. Ruiz has got a good chin, of course, but he was dog-tired in there. Dog-tired. But Miller didn't have the kind of power to capitalize on Ruiz's extreme fatigue. So he just kept trundling forward, putting the shots together, bullying Andy Ruiz in there, shrugging him off when he tried to clinch, going back to the body, upstairs, downstairs, just keeping his hands moving. Now, Ruiz did pick up, a couple more rounds later on in the fight where Jarrell Miller took his foot off the gas a bit. But for my money, not enough rounds to get the draw that he actually got. And bear in mind, I'm not trying to defend any prediction here, folks. I picked Andy Ruiz to win, okay? So I'm not trying to be biased in favor of Miller. I'm just telling you what I saw, right? I picked Andy Ruiz to win on points. I thought it would be a tough, close fight, but I did pick Ruiz on points. But the way it played out, I couldn't give that to Andy Ruiz. I just could not give that fight to him. He got worked over in there. Now, after the fight, Ruiz revealed that he had a broken hand. And this is where I want to give Ruiz a lot of credit because his hand was all types of jacked up. That was a terrible break. And what's really incredible is the fact that Andy Ruiz kept throwing that right hand over and over again after it was broken against Jarrell Miller's massive cement block of a head. So Andy Ruiz is incredibly tough. Unbelievably tough to continue throwing punches when his hand's that jacked up. The pain must have been excruciating. I broke my hand back in the days in sparring. I was wearing a pair of gloves that weren't fit for purpose, and it was just a hairline fracture, nothing like the break that Andy Ruiz had. And the pain was incredible just from a hairline fracture. The pain went all up my arm, almost took my breath away in the initial moments when it happened. So for Andy Ruiz, honestly, to fight on, punching a guy in the head when his hand is that jacked up, yeah, that's incredible. So he's an extremely tough man. Both guys evidently are. Miller's extremely tough. Ruiz is extremely tough. Andy Ruiz called for a rematch afterwards. I guess he didn't like his performance. I don't hate a rematch, but the first fight wasn't good enough for me to be particularly excited for it. You know, it was a grueling fight. It started quite well, but it kind of descended a little bit, into a sloppy, mauling type of fight. And again, the thing that kind of took some excitement away is that it became evident quite quick that neither guy could really put a serious dent in the other with their punches. Again, Miller got buzzed a couple times early on, but nothing major. And Ruiz, even though he was dog tired, he was never hurt by anything that Miller hit him with. And Miller did catch him with some clean headshots, uppercuts, hooks, and all that. And I have to figure a rematch would be more of the same. Another grueling 12-round affair. So I'm not overly keen on a rematch. I can understand the need for one because it was controversial. Andy Ruiz was fighting in LA here in front of loads of Mexican supporters who cheered him into the ring, but actually booed him afterwards and cheered his opponent Jarrell Miller. Just to put things in perspective. His own supporters thought he lost. So Ruiz wants to run it back and try and do better next time, but he's going to be out for quite a long time with that hand injury. That's a terrible, terrible break. I mean, the bone was damn near piercing through the skin. So that's going to take a good long while to get fixed. He's probably going to have a metal plate or something put in there. And in the meantime, of course, is Andy Ruiz going to do other types of training to keep the weight off? Because I think this was his heaviest weight since the AJ rematch. And he came up with a bunch of excuses, of course, for why he was this heavy. So we'll see what happens. As for Jarrell Miller, he did somewhat redeem himself following the loss to Daniel Dubois. And there's some interesting matchups to be made with Jarrell Miller. Miller against Bacoli, I'd like to see that. Miller against Zhang, yeah, why not? Zhang's got suspect stamina. Miller's very high volume, but Zhang has got crazy power. The type of power that Miller has never tasted, at least not in a professional fight. In fact, Miller said he'd still be interested in fighting Jared Anderson, despite the fact that Anderson lost to Martin Bacoli. They've got some type of issue with each other, not just over the name Big Baby, which they both use. So yeah, there you have it. Controversial draw between Andy Ruiz and Jarrell Miller. Grueling fight. I wouldn't be mad if they just left it there because we all saw what happened. I think most people will agree that Jarrell Miller deserved to get the victory. And because I think most of the public think Miller won, I don't necessarily think he needs to run it back because of the involvement now of the Saudis, right? Where they're still willing to give you an opportunity. You're not relying on rankings with a sanctioning body to get an opportunity. If Turki Al-Sheikh thinks you put on a good display, and he said in the post-fight interview, Turki Al-Sheikh that is, that he thought Miller won. So he'll surely give Miller another opportunity off the back of that. And Miller, of course, was really laying it on thick in the post-fight interview with his praise for the Saudis and all this type of stuff. He's a businessman. Now, I don't want to show too much sympathy for Jarrell Miller because at the end of the day, this guy is a multi-time drug cheat. I don't believe in karma. I don't believe karma is a real thing, but you could call this result poetic justice for Jarrell Miller, right? He's cheated many times in the past and now he's been cheated. He did get a 2-year ban, of course, but for the amount of times he's failed PED tests, was that really sufficient? You guys let me know what you think in the comment section below. If you disagree with my assessment of the fight, as in thinking that Jarrell Miller won, let me know in the comments. Explain it to me. I'm not saying it's the worst robbery I've ever seen in boxing, but bear in mind, one of the judges had Miller winning by, 3 or 4 rounds? In front of Andy Ruiz's fans. Okay, so you explain that. And before I go, I just want to tell you about this week's exclusive boxing content. I've just uploaded this hour-long, in-depth film study of the Jared Anderson-Martin Bacoli fight to my Patreon page, where I analyze the actual video footage and point out the mistakes that both guys made, as well as the things they did right, and ultimately the specific defensive errors which led to Anderson's defeat.